And with that, welcome to episode 3 of the Golf War. Happy to be with you again. This episode, I think, is going to be really interesting because we're really going to be looking at kind of the crux of this case study, which is the media. And I think this is something that you could argue is one of the most interesting aspects of this because, I think on one hand you have a very clear, and we'll get into this, conflict of interest. So essentially, the argument is that the media, and by media, I guess I should clarify to mean traditional media, is incredibly connected to the PGA Tour. So if you look at the outlets that broadcast the tour on a weekly basis, ESPN, which uses featured group coverage on ESPN Plus every week, NBC and Golf Channel, which is kind of the main week in, week out, and also CBS has the access to weekend coverage to about half the tournaments. And collectively, that makes these networks over $600 million a year. So essentially, what we see emerging in this LIV versus PGA dispute is a battle between traditional golf media and what I would call non-traditional media. You could call it other things as well. And it also is really a schism between older and younger generations. It's about where you get your information, where you're watching golf, where you're reading about it. That's a really huge part. And so I think that's what I wanted to cover in this episode, maybe one of the most important episodes on this show. Essentially, I think you could say, and as we mentioned in the first episode with Brad Smith, basically most of these main traditional media, this legacy media, has been incredibly hostile to LIV. And I do think some of that is warranted because, you have this attempted shots fired at the status quo, which is their brand. And I think essentially what we're going to see is that they have been very protective of their brand. And, it really does make sense. If you're an organization like an ESPN or a Golf Channel and NBC, pretty much your entire golf coverage is dedicated to the PGA Tour or the majors. So it's really not a surprise that they would view LIV as a threat to their, not just their coverage, but their business product. It really does make a lot of sense, but it also does create some problems when they're the ones covering, this, or in the case of a lot of these networks, they just don't cover. And so that's really essentially what happens. If you want to look at Golf Channel, they're pretty much 24/7 coverage during the daytime hours at least. I mean, pretty much never did they ever talk about any LIV events. And why is that? Well, it's because Golf Channel and the PGA Tour are in pretty much exclusive rights with each other. So you're saying pretty much the premier network for any golf fan to watch golf or coverage of golf occurs on a network that is exclusively tied to the PGA Tour. So you can understand why that makes it very difficult for them to talk about LIV in an honest way. Now, a lot of their analysts, and another one that Brad brought up was Randall Chambly, who is a really big name in the name of golf, in the field of golf, just because he's known for his hot takes, and he's had them for years. This isn't just a recent thing, but he has been very, very critical of LIV Golf and specifically the ties to the PIF and some of the human rights abuses that the Saudi Arabian government has been a part of. So when you see golf fans getting exposed to this kind of nonstop bashing of LIV, it's definitely fair to say that traditional legacy media, their coverage of LIV has not been fair, I think you could say. Not that what they're saying about LIV is untrue, but they're really only painting one side of the picture. So I do think that's a fair thing to point out. But, and maybe even more interestingly, we also see this new format of media, and not just golf media, but just media in general. And that's something that we're seeing a lot of younger generations of people latch onto. And that's why if you look at studies, you look at surveys, you look at polls, and you just look at online social media presence, LIV is much more popular among younger generations. It's really not a surprise when you think about it, because a lot of their messages, as we've talked about in episode 2, is more targeted towards that younger audience. But I just think that's really interesting that, if you think about it, occurs in a lot of different aspects of life. They're just completely different media ecosystems, and it really does determine how we view the world. Perception and reality are not the same thing, but for all intents and purposes, they really are, because what you perceive to be reality is your reality. And so that's really what we have going on here. The older generations and traditional golf fans, very much anti-LIV. And I think some of that is just because of what they're used to, and the PGA Tour is what they're used to. But it's also just a fact that the coverage they're watching on a daily basis is either A, anti-LIV, or B, not talking about them at all. And so it really makes sense that they're not huge golf fans. Like, you have to go out of your way to find the LIV content, if you're not exposed to that on a daily basis for the older generations. But for the younger generations, what is really emerging is non-traditional, non-legacy media. So let's just talk about some of those. You have your YouTube creators, things like Good, a lot of the Barstool channels. A lot of these channels are really popular, and you can just look at the ratings. They have tens of millions of views every year. And, it's really incredible to think about that essentially these formats are even more popular than the PGA Tour or LIV Golf. Like, this is where people are watching golf, is on YouTube creators. For me personally, it's not something I watch because I just don't have the time for that. But it's really popular with a lot of people my age, our age. And I just think that's really interesting, that it's not a surprise to me that I see so many people my age, fans of LIV, or at least curious about its product, when they see this stuff a lot. But it's not just the YouTube creators. Although, just for example, a lot of these players like Bryson, who I think we're going to talk about in a later episode in his specific YouTube show, but Bryson DeChambeau, really popular LIV player, he has his show and a lot of guests, very prominent guests on it, but he's kind of the face of LIV Golf, and yet he also has one of the most highly rated, YouTube shows out there for golf. And I think that's really interesting, but it's not just on YouTube, as I mentioned. It's all over Instagram, Twitter. There is a very golf-specific online community that is very open to LIV and honestly has a lot of concerns about the tour. They take the player's side in the sense that they know there are problems with the tour structure in terms of how they're paying players. There was actually something really interesting out in the last couple of weeks, that the PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan, who has been really central to these negotiations and the LIV bashing, but just the conversation that golf has been having over the last couple years, is making about $23 million a year. And that is something that is just really shocking to a lot of even golf fans that are really supportive of the tour. They're like really surprised to hear this. And I mean, if you know anything about how these leagues work, it's probably not that big of a surprise. But on one hand, it's really hard for him to complain about players going and taking money when he's, in a yearly basis, making more money than the guys actually playing golf. And that's, I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but I can understand the frustration with that. But it's when you see stories like this come out that maybe a lot of golf fans that aren't exposed to that every day, they start to maybe think about it and at least have a more neutral position. I mean, again, I'll say this many times on the show, but I am someone who is not really taking a side in this dispute. I have a lot of concerns with LIV Golf, but ultimately I just want, there to not be so much division in the golf world. And so, I'm open to whatever sort of merge we can have just to get this period of division behind us. But I think if you look at a lot of this content on social media, this is the new and emerging media landscape. It's playing a bigger role in all of our lives, and it's going to continue doing that But essentially the argument is that this is the new form of media, and this form of media is a lot more open to live golf than the traditional media. And if you think about it, it really makes sense, because this is not a threat to their business. They're actually making their business on covering what a lot of the traditional legacy media is not covering. So, it really does make sense in that regard, and that's why I honestly find this just a really fascinating angle to look at this LIV-PGA Tour debate from, because it's really interesting to see this schism between traditional legacy media and the new media. And, I've mentioned this a lot, and you can find a little bit more details about this on the website. But obviously, if LIV had more options in traditional media, they'd go that route, but they really don't. Those routes have been closed off to them, probably for good reason, but it's also a conflict of interest. Let's just be honest. We don't have to lie about that. But I do think that having this new emerging media landscape on their side is maybe going to pay off long term. Now, listen, I don't think the LIV Tour is going to be necessarily a thing 20, 30 years down the line. I think it's going to be under the same umbrella as the PGA Tour, but I think what we've essentially going to see is that once we end up seeing a merger happen, it's going to mean something different for golf, because the fans' way of watching golf is going to change, but also how we even view watching a tournament is going to change. I think there's a lot of room for changes in the golf world, and it could mean a younger, more diverse fan base, and that's a good thing ultimately for golf. The last thing I want to mention is just, I think in a lot of things the media does play a role in how the public perceives things. And this is reflected across society in general, and it was reflected in the most recent presidential election. People are mistrusting of traditional media. And because of that, we're now seeing a new emerging media ecosystem. Now, you could debate whether it's a good or bad thing. I don't think having more information, more outlets out there is a bad thing. But we do have a responsibility as a society to be a little bit responsible in the data and information we're consuming, what we're believing. So I do think that's interesting, but we can definitely see this mirrored across society. A mistrust of traditional legacy media is opening new doors for new generations of and new types of media. The last thing I want to talk about is the way the media has talked about the potential merger. Interestingly, there are a lot of ways you can break news. You can do it on social media. You can just do it yourself with a press conference. When the PGA Tour and the Saudi PIF, so the LIV, wanted to announce that they were entering negotiations to form a merger, the format in which they did so, I think, was very interesting. They, and by they, I mean PGA Tour Commissioner Jay Monahan and the Saudi governor of the PIF, went on a CNBC, so traditional legacy media show, Squawk Box, and they did this announcement on live cable television, live news television, an economics-themed cable news show. And so I think that setting was really just a very interesting choice. I'm not sure. I'd be interested to know the discussions that went into why that was where they decided to do it, but it almost frames it from the tour's perspective as they're making this merger as an economic decision for them, which it is. They really can't be at war with LIV for too much longer, or it's just not going to work for them financially in the long run. But I think that was a very important setting for this to be announced, and I do think there are some interesting discussions that could come from that. So this was episode 3 of the Golf War. Our next episode, we're going to be interviewing Nico Marin. He's a teammate of mine on the Webster Golf team. He and I are going to be talking about why LIV is appealing to younger fans and mainly international fans. And as we talked about in episode 1, also international golfers, trying to poach them away from the tour. I think that'll be a good conversation for the viewers to listen to and maybe just have that other side, other perspective of why some people are open to LIV. But the last two episodes 5 and 6, after my interview with Nico, are going to focus on some of the ethical claims about LIV, and I really want to give some attention to those because I do think they're an important part of the conversation. So this has been episode 3 Media or Mediator. If you want to find out more information, feel free to look on the website. A lot of good sources on there that I think really get at kind of the crux of what I was talking at on this podcast today. This is episode 3 of the Golf War. Stay tuned down the line for episode 4. That'll be coming up soon. Thank you for listening, as always.